Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yolene Kaja. I am a student president for the UNICEF Club at Eastern. Thank you for joining us for today's University Hours, a talk with human rights activist Maryam Elahi. I would like to thank the Women's Center for hosting this program. Today's speaker, Maryam Elahi, has spent 25 years in the international human rights community as an advocate, teacher, and a grant maker. Previously, she served as the Director of International Women's Program at the Open Society Foundation and was the founding director of the Human Rights Program at Trinity College in Hartford. Maryam also served as the Advocacy Director on the Middle East, North Africa, and the European at Amnesty International between the year of 1999 and 1997. Today, Maryam Elahi is the president and the CEO of the Community Foundation of Eastern Connecticut. We are delighted to have Maryam here with us. As a student leader, I am inspired by women like Maryam Elahi. She's one who that is dedicated to inspire us as a student to use our voice and strength to talk back to injustice that perpetuate violence on our campus, in our individual communities and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Maryam Elahi.
Thank you. Hello, how are you doing? Can you hear me? Great. Well, let me know if you can't, and I would like to come closer to you after I've finished my remarks, but I've made some notes so I don't want to forget what I wanted to say, and I think those who are recording us want me to use the microphone so that it can be heard well on the recording. So I was asked to talk about my years as a student activist many years ago and what led me to become involved in human rights, the kind of work that I did in terms of activism as a student, and what I thought, what kind of strategies were effective. I'm going to do that. Come on in. Come on in. Welcome. But I'd also like to share with you examples of work that I've done since I left the life of being a student, and happy to engage in a conversation afterwards, talk a little bit more about that. So this is my story. I was a biology major. I wanted to become a neurosurgeon, and I was at Williams College, finished my junior year, and I got this job, which for me was very interesting, a summer job working at Boston Children's Hospital in their neuroscience lab. It doesn't sound so great if you're not a bio major, but it was guillotining little rats, mice, taking out their optic nerve, preparing it for the electron microscope, and through that process learning how neurotransmitters work. There are different theories of how when you pinch a finger you feel pain, and so kind of looking at how these neurotransmitter processes worked, and I was very excited to be doing this that summer. Just by chance, I stumbled into a talk that was being given there by a physician. His name was Jonathan Fine, who had just returned from Chile and Guatemala. The year was 1982, way before you guys were born, and the most of Latin America was ruled by military strongmen. So there was tremendous human rights violations going on in most of Latin America. Massive torture, disappearances, extrajudicial killings, rape, etc. And I did not know a thing about these sort of issues, about human rights violations. So I felt, as I walked into that lecture and listened, I felt like somebody pulled out my soul, shook it and put it back. It just changed my outlook on life. And I went back home that night thinking, how can I do something about this kind of stuff going on in the world? So I did. I went back my senior year. I just had one biology course to take. It was my senior seminar. And I overloaded on courses in in philosophy and political science, which were all new to me. It was like a whole universe had opened up. Curtains had gone back, and I was just absorbing like a sponge, whether I was reading Camus or learning about what was happening in different parts of the world. It was very exciting, and I just felt totally pulled in. And that's how you should feel as a young person. You should just feel the world's your oyster. You should be learning all the time and feeling that you want to be engaged. So since I didn't have anyone talking to me about things like pacing yourself and making choices, etc., I threw myself into every opportunity and project which I could to make a difference. So at the time, there was apartheid in South Africa. Everyone knows what I'm talking about, yeah? And at any time that you don't know what I'm talking about, just raise a hand. I don't mind being interrupted. And there was a massive student activism going on to end apartheid in South Africa. The injustice of it, the separation of blacks and whites, and the sort of powerful hierarchy of whites in that country. So there were a lot of students that were active on the Williams campus. We took over the Dean's building. And I want to say, I'm not making any suggestions here, but we essentially took over the Dean's building for days, asking that the college divest its investments from any companies that were doing work in South Africa. And this is sort of the divestment movement that was really strong in the 1980s in the student movements. And students were looking at where their universities and colleges were investing their monies, and they wanted it to be clean, and South Africa was definitely a target. So we had conversations with the president of the college, and also I was involved as a leader in one of the student organizations. So all of us who were leaders decided that on a weekend when we were meeting with the trustees of the college that we would take up the issue of divesting from South Africa. You can imagine, to the trustees and president, these were, we came across as being very naive about how the investment worked. But in reality, we knew and have thereafter, since things have changed drastically in South Africa, thereafter learned from people who were on the ground that it was a tremendous symbolic gesture, and it did bring about ripples of change which changed the situation there. So we did a lot of things related to apartheid. We created the townships on our campus. We tried to portray through theater and other means what it meant to have a system of apartheid, of that level of differences based on skin color. And the college eventually did divest, but it was one of the last ones to do so. At the same time, there were wars going on in Central America, in particular in El Salvador and Nicaragua. And the United States was very much involved by supporting one side of the conflict. And I got involved with different groups that were working on solidarity. So there was a whole movement to provide solidarity for people, families who were escaping the wars, and to also get the word out about what was happening, who the different sides were, what the Contras were asking, what the Sandinistas were all about, and trying to really educate our communities. And one of the things that we did is we started a radio station, and I'm not sure if Eastern has, if you have a radio station, but we created something we called, and I'm dating myself because this is way back, we called it Third World News. And so throughout the week, we would be researching what was happening, particularly in Central America, but all over, that would not have been featured in mainstream news. And then we had about an hour to 2 hours every Sunday where we would have a news program and we would talk about it, and people within the sort of nearby towns could hear that. At the same time, there was a major incident that happened in Lebanon. It was the Sabra and Shatila massacre of Palestinians in a refugee camp in Lebanon by the Israeli army. So we gathered people together and had a conversation trying to find out what was happening and whether we could send blankets to humanitarian groups and just have a sense of openness and curiosity about what was going on. And we called the group Friends of the Palestinian People or something like that. But it was all new and we were all learning. And I also got involved in the local groups that were working in the very area that the college was in, that were very focused on poverty, soup kitchens, and relief to families nearby who had been suffering because of the economic downturn in the country. So for me, that human rights lecture that I walked to in 1982 changed my life. It was really a calling, but it was kind of an awakening as to the situation around me and in the world. And the mere fact that you guys are here, I will presume, means to me that you've gone a step further, that you recognize that there are human rights abuses, there is injustice in the world, and that you're here because you care and you're thinking about, well, what can you do to make a difference? And so I just want to remind you that even the most powerful fortresses in the world since Roman times have come down because a coalition of people who were committed got together to bring about change. So you should never feel alone or concerned about the fact that the problems, because they do seem daunting, that the problems are so daunting and how can you make a difference. The mere fact that you are involved, engaged, educate yourself, get together with other people to bring about a difference does make a change. So here are some thoughts that I had in terms of how you could get involved if this is your day zero. I would say start off as broadly as you can, educate yourself on all sorts of issues, from what does it mean to be concerned about GMO products and what are genetically modified organisms. Why is there a problem with it? What are the farmers' issues on both sides of the framework and what feels right or wrong to you? To the larger issues dealing with water rights, globally, locally, nationally, women's rights, child rights, labor rights, the issues of concern about whether it is problematic to buy toys because they're made in China or to wear a dress because it's made by children in India, etc. I would just say try to be as open-minded and broad as you can and educate yourself on both arguments, both sides of the argument on these types of issues. And then pick 3 or 4 issues that you really want to put your heart and soul into. I think when you go beyond that, you thin out your efforts. But if you pick 3 or 4 issues that you really care about, always think about something local where you could sort of roll up your sleeves on something that is local and where in the short term you can make a difference and see it. Remember that some of these long-term issues, whether it's ending a war or addressing war victims, etc., they're really long-term and you need to be involved in a coalition, work with other people to bring about change. Then I would say get to know your members of Congress, both state and nationally. See how they vote and think about how you want to influence them. How many people in this room are eligible to vote? Okay. How many of you did vote yesterday? Okay. Let's move that number up. I'm a big believer in the right to vote. I originally, my family left Iran in the middle of a revolution. I was a young teenager, and my career in human rights has taken me to many, many countries where people don't have a right to vote. And yesterday I was talking to someone who said, you know, of course, I got up early, very eagerly went there and voted. And I asked her, did you vote? She said, no, I've been at work and running errands all day. And I thought to myself, you know, people have died, have fought and died for your right to vote in this country, everywhere around the world. Do not take it lightly. take it very seriously. That's the way that you get your voice to a higher pitch and higher level. You vote and you let your members of Congress know that you're watching what they're doing and let them know what you believe in. And then remember that at the end of the day, you can bring about a shift in policy issues. So many of us get involved in humanitarian issues. You know, you'll write a letter, sign a letter, send blankets to this organization, help with the food pantry, getting food out, etc. These are all important and they make a difference. But in my mind, I usually think of them as Band-Aid differences. They're differences that have impact in the short term, but policy differences are the ones that are long-term when you change policies. So you want to educate yourself throughout this whole process and think about how you can bring about changes in policy. And that's where having access to your members of Congress makes a huge difference. And you know, in the human rights world, very often you feel alone. You feel like, I don't know, how many of you know the myth of Sisyphus? You don't. Okay. So it's one of these old Greek myths. It's about Sisyphus being condemned by the gods to roll up a boulder up a mountain. The boulder is heavy. He's rolling it up. And you know what happens when a boulder is up? It rolls back down. And he has to do this for eternity. And I think that many human rights activists feel that that's what they're doing their entire life. But as you have more and more Sisyphi, welcome, with you, the boulders will feel lighter because the burden does lighten up. So I think that the important message that I've learned throughout my career is the more people you get involved in the work that you're doing, the change that you're making, the lighter the burden and the more likelihood that you will feel effective. So now I want to tell you a story, something that's very close to my heart. It's about a campaign at Amnesty International that we had in the early 1990s. Just to give you a real, tangible sense that you can make a difference. So the country, how many of you know that Morocco was the first country to recognize the United States? See? It's a bit of trivia that now you can put out there. So the friendship between the U.S. and Morocco is an old friendship. And this was a time right after the first Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War, the war against Iraq when Iraq had traversed into Kuwait. And a number of countries had been, in the region, had been involved with the United States in this endeavor. Morocco had been one. And the King of Morocco was coming to the United States, and it was going to be a very grand ceremony with President George Bush, the first George Bush, sort of presiding, had invited him. It was the first visit of the king, King Hassan of Morocco. And Morocco was a kingdom with massive human rights violations. There were thousands and thousands of political prisoners. Torture was rampant. There was no freedom of speech. And there were disappearances, thousands of disappearances, people who had been picked up from their homes, taken to prisons, and nobody knew where they were. So they could be presumed dead, they might be alive, but their families hadn't heard from them and nobody knew where they were. So this, we learned about the King's visit. We had a couple of weeks to prepare for it at Amnesty International. We wanted to make sure that we used this opportunity strategically to get the word out about what was happening in Morocco, but also to try and use this opportunity as a triggering point to bring about changes. And there were a whole bunch of players that fell into pieces. And this is, when I think about what happened, I will call it unlikely partnerships. Because for Amnesty International, the State Department, members of Congress to get involved working on this sort of a campaign was a high unlikelihood. There were a number of members of Congress that were in key positions. They were heading the Africa Subcommittee, Foreign Relations Subcommittee, etc. They knew, as we had been briefing them over the years, about the horrendous situation in Morocco, and they started having hearings every week about human rights violations in Morocco. So I would be going and providing testimony, and Morocco's neighboring countries, Algeria and Tunisia, were delighted. So the information, and you know how some neighboring countries have a lot of sharp elbowing, a lot of rivalry, etc. So this was something that they were playing up in their presses. The State Department was very concerned that there would be massive protests when the King of Morocco was coming, and that they were reminded of the fact that the Shah of Iran had come during President Carter's years, and as he was being greeted in the White House lawn, there had been massive protests and the police had to use tear gas. So they didn't want that to happen again. So the State Department reached out to us at Amnesty International and said, let's work together. We can be good cop, bad cop, and we have similar interests. We want this visit to go well. You want an end to human rights violations. Let's see if we can do something together. So it was really amazing because we had all this information on the disappearances, political prisoners, torture. So we were putting out different press briefings and information every other day. And the State Department was putting pressure on the Moroccan embassy, on the foreign ministry of Morocco back home. And the King of Morocco was a very powerful person, and no one in his government wanted to ever be accused of not ensuring that the visit had gone smoothly. So the unthinkable happened. About 2 days before the King's visit, I got into the Amnesty office in the morning and had a call from our international secretariat saying, you won't believe what's happened. In the last 24 hours, thousands and thousands of the disappeared in Morocco are reappearing. They had been sent to hospitals in some cases. In some cases, they had been, given medication, etc., so that they would look better, feel better, etc. But short of it was that the government of Morocco had felt the pressure. They knew that this was the sort of thing that would bring them immediate positive publicity, but also more importantly, that the King's visit for them, the King's visit would go smoothly. So it was unbelievable. We couldn't keep up with the names of the people who'd been released. I mean, at the end of it, it was over 2,000, and some of them, I remember there were these three brothers, the Burqa brothers, who had been thrown into this prison cell that was 10 feet by 3 feet long, 10 by 3, just imagine, and it was less than 4 feet high, and they would get 1 hour of sunshine or time out of their cells a day. So there were some really horrendous situations. The people were released. The King's visit went smoothly because, after all, we had only great things to say because it had been a very dramatic changeover. And I suspected, as one often does, that he would go back and people would be nabbed and imprisoned and everything would roll back. But in fact, it didn't. And changes came about, and there were pressures on the regime, and they did move forward in terms of having massive reforms in their political laws, etc., etc. So it was, for me, it's one of the most impressive stories of short-term impact in the human rights community that I'm aware of. And I'm sure that those who were imprisoned for over 20 years didn't feel it was short-term, but the fact that we had this window of opportunity and we used it very strategically to bring about change made a big difference. So I guess I tell you that story because I do think there's light at the end of the tunnel, and when you get involved in doing this kind of work, you always need to be reminded of that, and I'm always reminded of that, even though now I'm in a very different field of work. I guess I will stop my talk right now and give time for us to have a conversation, but I would like to leave us at just remembering that that it is very often because you get in partnership with unlikely partners, with people with whose view you generally disagree, that you can have impact. So it's so much more comfortable and easier to work in coalition with people that you feel are like-minded. But it's when you're effective in bringing people whose views are very different to the table that you can actually see a movement, a strategic shift forward to bring about change. So let me stop now so we have a little bit of time for conversation, and I'm happy to talk about anything I've talked about or the last 25 years, the work that I've done in the human rights field and what I'm doing currently at the Community Foundation. Questions? Yolaine, you must have a question.
Because I'm always interested in human rights, and because I'm also involved with the United Nations Children Emergency Fund. I was saying, like, I'm really interested in human rights, and I've been involved with the UNICEF for the United Nations Children Emergency Fund because I really believe in children's rights, and I believe that children are the basic foundation of this future. So it's good that for them to have like right to education and right of life and all these other things that we have in the U.S. So yeah.
So I'm hoping to get some tough questions, some good questions. I've been here at Eastern a couple of times, and you guys always ask good questions. So. Yes. Can I give you the microphone so everyone can hear you? Okay.
What exactly was your role when you worked with Amnesty International? Like, what did you do in the organization?
First, is there an Amnesty chapter here? No, okay, because I know a lot of schools have it. I used to be the advocacy director on Middle East, Europe, and North Africa. And what that really meant was I was Amnesty's point person in Washington on all the countries in the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. So when I was there, I got the job 2 weeks after Iraq invaded Kuwait. So a lot of time was being spent testifying before Congress. That was a lot of what I did. Talk to members of Congress, State Department, and ambassadors from all the countries I covered. So that was big. And then Bosnia fell apart. It used to be called Yugoslavia. It became former Yugoslavia as all the different countries fell into pieces, and there was huge conflict in the region. The former Soviet Union, so it was in my region. So as the Soviet Union broke off and there were conflicts, Chechnya, Northern Ireland, Israel, and so forth. So it was a region with lots of fires to put out. And what I would do is provide testimony to members of Congress, go and talk to them about what was happening, which is what I'm encouraging you guys to do. Talk to them about what was happening in different countries and make suggestions of what they could be doing. And then try and talk to the State Department and provide recommendations. So I did that at Amnesty, and when I was with the Open Society Foundations, I was directing our International Women's Program, and we focused on countries which were in conflict, because that's where women's situations are the most dire. So some of the countries we worked on were the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, Kenya, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Colombia, Guatemala, Iraq, Palestine, Nepal, Cambodia, and so forth. Yes?
What are some challenges do you have or did you face as a human rights activist? And also, like, can we get an internship at the Amnesty International?
You can absolutely get an internship at Amnesty International, but I have no control over it. So you need to apply, and They have a very active internship. They love students. And I would recommend start an Amnesty chapter at Eastern. That's a lot of schools, a lot of universities have Amnesty chapters. You can get started there. But your question was what kind of challenges? Challenges are a lot. First of all, when people ask about personal challenges, they say, so you were dealing with torturers, going to countries where there were serious human rights violations. I never felt that maybe it was stupid, because in some countries we were followed around by the nasty police and military, etc. But I never felt personally endangered. But the biggest challenges were convincing, our leaders, our congressional leaders, and so forth, that it is in the long-term interest of the United States to make policies based on human rights performance. And I think that members of Congress and statesmen very often are thinking about military and economic partnerships and don't take into account human rights. That's changed a lot for the better in the last 3 decades. President Carter really pushed a human rights pillar towards our foreign policy, and it's taken a long time, but it's no longer sort of a laughing horse. It's no longer something that people take lightly, and many members of Congress will raise concerns about sending funding to countries that have a serious human rights record, because it will come back to haunt you. Look at the situation in Afghanistan. The United States supported the people who were fighting against the Soviets, who then became the Taliban and fought against the United States. So you have to be mindful of what you're doing and who you're partnering with and how you want to make a difference. Now, you gentlemen of that row, one of you must have a smart question. I believe in the Socratic method. Come on. You have a loud voice? Okay, yeah. Speak up.
Did you have any difficulties with being a woman in the human rights movement?
That's a very good question. So the question was if I had difficulty being a woman in the human rights movement. I did not. I think you can tell I'm not a wallflower. I was very comfortable. I felt that I stood on very strong principles. And that was what was being discussed, and the fact that my gender was irrelevant in my own head. So I think once you move in that direction, you don't allow for much questioning. But I was also always very mindful of local customs, dress codes, etc. So I wouldn't want to be offending people of a culture, but at the same time, I thought that it was very important also to model for women in that culture that they could also stand up and raise questions. Thank you. That's a very good question. Any questions here? Yes.
What has been your role, if any, in the Ebola crisis currently going on?
So the question is about the Ebola crisis. I haven't been involved. So now my role as president and CEO of the Community Foundation is very different, because we are essentially a philanthropic institution. We support the needs, interests of our region to create a more thriving community. So, whether it's the homeless shelter or, after school programs or whatever it is, we have a number of funders who are caring about the community, and we support all of these initiatives. But I do have sort of very strong beliefs that, like everything else, that we are an interconnected world. So when people say, why should I care about this? It's happening in Africa. It doesn't touch me. Yes, it does touch you. And the more interconnected the world has become, the more we know about what goes on elsewhere, but the more we're affected by it. So, clearly we have people who have a huge heart in our communities who go to other places and try to do good, and viri spread. So we need to be aware of that. We need to be mindful, but we also need to do whatever we can to help stop the spread of illnesses and diseases elsewhere, because we have the ability to do that. So we should. Yes?
Have you done any philanthropy towards
Yes. So it's very interesting that you should ask, because I'm talking to another group later on today about what we've done. So the Community Foundation actually has 4 women's funds. This is a funny thing about Connecticut is, first of all, I didn't know a thing about community foundations until I joined this community foundation, but they are, just as the name suggests, foundations and philanthropic institutions that care deeply about their community. Most states, not all, but most states have one. So you have the Vermont Community Foundation, the Maine Community Foundation, etc. But we have 14 here in Connecticut. So we have the largest footprint, land footprint in eastern Connecticut. We have 4 women and girls funds that have supported a myriad of initiatives on women and girls issues across the state. So, the funds have grown over the years. There's about 2.8 million in them, and there are a lot of grants. In fact, I just come from a meeting that we were talking about grants. And the grants can be as varied as education for young girls and men on reproductive rights, or they can be very focused on empowerment of girls for public speaking, or they can be focused on helping find job opportunities for older women who've lost their jobs and are having a hard time surviving. Yep. That row, you guys must have more questions. You can't just rely on your RA to have the smart question. Come on, pressure. You're smiling. Yes.
More of a specific question. What's your opinion on the Burqa ban in France? Do you find it to be intolerance or fighting for the rights of women?
That's a great question. And you'll find that the human rights community is very divided on that. Let me just explain it to everyone else. So she asked about the Burqa ban in France. It's banning wearing a full hijab or a full coverage. And I think in England they've banned it too, or they got pretty close to, I thought, the legislation passed. So the argument has been varied. Some people who were pushing for it argued that, it is about security, being able to see who you're dealing with. Some people argued that it's about assimilation and accepting the culture of where you are. When we go to countries where they wear burqa, our women are required to wear burqa. If they come to our countries, at the very least they can assimilate, etc. And I think it's very complicated. I would like to think that I'm all for freedom of expression, and I would like to think that to the degree possible, people should be allowed to express themselves in the way they dress and they speak, etc., as long as it's not offensive to someone else. And it's very hard to argue that a burqa is offensive, although the security argument could have some weight. I think that the other part of it that really touches me is about a woman's full freedom. And if you want women to feel completely free to dress as they wish, to do what they want to professionally, and to be educated in whatever field they're interested in, is the burqa holding them back? And I think there's great arguments on all sides, and I could see myself taking different positions along the way. But I think it's one of those very complicated conversations that I would actually love to hear a panel discussion about it, because as I said, I can argue all the different positions of it. It's a great question. Okay, I won't pick on you guys. Yes?
So you've done tons of global work, and now you're doing more community-based.
Yes.
What would you like better, or could you even compare the two? Or
Yes.
do you make it more of like
Yes.
a spectrum and intertwined?
So the question is, the distinctions between global and community work, as you put it, but local work, and which one's better or how. So my answer is actually that all work is local work. So even when you work on when people say they work on international issues and global issues, they're really working with local communities in those countries. And at the end of the day, what you learn as you do that is that only when local leaders, community leaders, are committed to embracing change do you see transformational change. Otherwise, you don't. And so you have to work with local leaders to bring about change. And what I love about the work that I do now is that after 26 years of working on very heart-wrenching issues, from torture, rape, mayhem, disappearances, executions, etc. Now I'm really dealing with watching seeds grow and supporting great local initiatives that are good things and will make a difference. And that is wonderful because, at some point you need to be looking at the blue skies and good things. And I think it's told me that you always need to have that kind of balance in your life. So for many of us in the human rights field, I think the cost is you really burn out because for too long you're dealing with heart-wrenching issues without a break. And the story I told you about Morocco is one of a very few in a handful that I could really pick out that has that kind of success story to it. People who are now working on human rights in the Middle East are devastated. I mean, it's just imagine all the structures, etc., that are decimated, and it's a very bleak time. Well, I would love to ask you guys a question. For those of you who weren't asked by your faculty to come, why are you here? What interested you in this conversation? Will you say? No? Yes. Yes.
I've always been interested in human rights. I do a lot of disasters, and I actually want to go to grad school for international human rights as a graduate program. Basically, do like a fellow institute. I was actually going to ask you a question about the Congo and you were in there and working with issues there. And the history of the Congo overcome up with the developing Congo, and do you believe that the history of the idea of human rights came out of the developing Congo because all the telegrams and all the telegraphs that came out of that?
That's a very, very good question. I'm not sure everyone knows about this. But anyways, in terms of pursuing a career in international human rights and grad school, I'd be happy to talk afterwards. No problem. In terms of, you have someone from the Congo who could probably address that better than me. But talking to human rights activists in the Congo in terms of their activism, you have different viewpoints. There are some people who will, point the finger to their former colonizers, the Belgians, and say they are the cause of the problem today. There are some people who remember their former head of state, Mobutu, who was a thief and who tortured many people, and that there were some people like Lumumba within that period who were trying to bring about a very positive change there, and the CIA had a role in all of that. So it's very complicated. People know the history, but at the end of the day, my whole view of these things is that you can't keep pointing your fingers and blaming your ancestors. You have to start now. So I tend to sort of at some point look at the historical analysis as, okay, it's very interesting and I really like to learn about it, but then I feel I need to act now and not look back and blame anyone else. Yes?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm originally from the Congo. I was partially raised there. With the whole situation going on, like she said, you can't really point out fingers on people. But right now, with the current situation, I think, and I believe that is the president, the current president, who's who's to blame for all the stuff that's happening. And I believe with a lot of African countries, when you have a weaker president, I think you also have like a weaker society where where people just abuse human rights. And I feel like as a president, you need to know what human right is. If your president really don't know what human right is, there is no way for them to have like an understanding of what needs to be done for the population, and like I don't know, like, human rights thing for other like people. So yeah, I don't know if that kind of like yeah, so it has to basically, it really has to start with the president, and our president is really weak. He's not really into understanding of human rights. He does, and the thing is, like, we blame him because we think he's not even Congolese. We think like he was adopted and brought to the country. So and then the funny thing is like we always make fun of him because he doesn't even speak the local language. So he didn't really grow up. He didn't even grow up in the Congo, and we just think like the whole thing with the election, there's corruption to it, and it kind of just like brings into a lot of things into the country. So, yeah.
Yes. Yes.
It's looking more likely that Hillary Clinton will run. Can you tell me, please, where she stands on what her major human rights issues or concerns are, and how much, like, where she stands on how hard she's going to fight for certain things?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think that on some issues she's going to be terrific, and I think that on some issues she's going to be extremely tough. And my view is that from what we've seen, because you can only assume based on how you saw she acted as Secretary of State. When there was the Beijing Conference on Women's Rights 2 decades ago, she went there and she used the terminology that feminists, women's rights activists were using, which is women's rights are human rights, duh. And she coined it in many ways in that conference. She has been, across the board, terrific on women's rights. She understands the complexities. She understands the whole issues of equity and empowerment and education. And so I think across the board on women's rights, she will be terrific. I think that, her husband, when he was president and the Rwandan genocide happened, afterwards there was an opportunity to apologize, and he did say, just remember, the United States doesn't have friends, it has interests. And I think that that's what superpowers believe, and superpowers are led by the very powerful men, women at the helm who have to carry forward this kind of thinking. So I think there will be times when human rights activists will be trying to break down her door and say, look, this is happening and we're not doing anything. And I think that she will say, we're not the policemen of the world, we can't or won't. And there may be times when, in the whole endeavor to hunt down Osama bin Laden and kill him, clearly she was very involved, very active in this sort of fight against terrorism, in which the human rights community has always said there's got to be a balance between respecting our liberties and rights and the fight against terror. That you can't just be, at large, recording everyone's phones because you're trying to throw the net on 5 people. So I think that there are areas that I would be looking very closely. But the reality is that she's very smart, and she would be a candidate which would bring a lot of interesting issues to the table for conversation. So it would be terrific to have candidates which, again, bring forth some of the most provocative issues and who have the courage to stand up and fight for what they believe in. And I think she would be. So it will be a very interesting, and I hope that whoever runs on the other side, if she is running, that they would also be someone who is smart and courageous and bring important issues to the table, so that we as a nation get involved on the big thinking issues that we want our leaders to be addressing, as opposed to the minutia that is now going on and fighting in the weeds. Well, I guess if there's no other questions, thank you for inviting me here, and I look forward to continuing to be in touch.